The following program features the opinions of the host. Listeners are encouraged to seek their own understanding.
Have you ever wondered why there are verses in the Bible where it seems that Yahweh is talking to someone other than the writer or reader of the Bible? Why does he sometimes seem to be referring to an us? Is this because he's a triune God, or is there something else here? Is it possible that Yahweh might have a group that he runs ideas by, or likes to have around as witnesses? Something like a board of directors. There are scholars who believe that there is a divine council because the Bible seems to indicate that this is the case. Could this divine council be the stones of fire that appear in 2 verses in Ezekiel? Welcome to the Ghost in You podcast, a podcast about the weird, the wonderful, and the terrifying in the Bible. I'm Diane Student, your guide and host on this strange journey through the Bible. Episode 19, Stones of Fire and the Divine Council. Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 14 to 16 reads, "You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire." Whether one believes these verses are talking about an earthly king, the king of Tyre, earlier in this chapter it does mention a king of Tyre, a lot of people believe that it could be talking about Lucifer or Satan. But what I want to zero in on here are the peculiar lines about these stones of fire. So I don't really want to focus on Lucifer and Satan or this king of Tyre at this point. I just want to know, what in the world are these stones of fire that are being mentioned here? A mind not keen on the supernatural might brush these off as describing some really shiny stones, perhaps crystals. For me, it seems odd that crystal-like stones would be singled out twice. Weren't there some trees or some other kind of vegetation on the holy mountain of God? Why not mention them? And the guardian cherub being referred to here seems to be in the midst of them. He walks among them and is cast out of the midst of them. The word for stone in Hebrew used here is eben, and this is from the root of banah, which means to build, set up, make, or repair. It was used to represent strength, firmness, and solidity. The word for fire in Hebrew used here is ayesh, which means burning, fiery, flaming, or hot. It's sometimes referred to a supernatural fire. This same Hebrew word was used for the burning bush that Moses experienced, and clearly that fire was supernatural as it didn't burn up the bush. And going a step further, we are to understand that this wasn't a fire at all, but rather the angel of the Lord, which most scholars understand to be Yeshua in his pre-incarnate form. Now, there are some who disagree. They don't believe that Yeshua came before his time when he was born on earth in some kind of a pre-incarnate form. I, however, do have some places where I think that's a possibility. I'm not exactly sure where I stand on that yet, but possibly Moses having any kind of interactions with some kind of a physical form of Yahweh could have been Yeshua, or it could have been Yahweh. Some commentators, particularly those that ignore just how supernatural the Bible is, claim that the stones of fire is referencing a wall of fire that protected the king of Tyre. But how is it possible to walk in the midst of a wall? It isn't possible. You don't walk in and around and through unless, of course, you're a ghost or something. There are those who believe that the stones of fire is another way of saying the stars of heaven, that perhaps this is some kind of portal to bring the angels into the presence of Yahweh. Being removed from the midst of the stones on the mountain of Yahweh meant losing access to God's throne. Biblical imagery often uses the term stars in reference to angels. Revelations chapter 12 verse 4 says of Satan that his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. So if stars of heaven is another way to say stones of fire, I think you're getting a picture of what these stones of fire more than likely are. From the episode on angels, we know that there's a class of angels referred to as seraphim or seraphim, however you want to say it. The Hebrew word is saraph, which means burning, poisonous, creature of copper color, fiery serpent. This is a root, to be on fire, burn, kindle. Could these seraphim be thought of as stones of fire? We can get a bit of an idea about the connection of fire and angels from 1 Enoch chapter 17, verse 1. And this is an extra biblical text, but I do like to use them occasionally for reference. And they took me to a place where they were like burning fire. And when they wished, they made themselves look like men. This verse is amazing because it not only indicates that angels can make themselves look like men, but clearly there are angels that look like burning fire. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 7 reads, "Of the angels he says, he makes his angels winds, and his ministers a flame of fire." Job chapter 38 verse 7 indicates the angels as stars and reads, "When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Again, we have more referencing here to the sons of God, which we know to be angels, being called morning stars that are singing together. The late Dr. Mike Heiser wrote many books on the supernatural in the Bible, and he hosted a podcast named The Naked Bible. On episode 92, he clearly states what I also believe to be true. The stones of fire are the members of the divine council. And what exactly is the divine council? There was no culture that resided in the Mediterranean area that didn't prescribe to some kind of concept of a divine council. Another term for this could be pantheon. Many of you are probably very familiar with the different pantheons of cultures like the Romans and the Greeks and the Mesopotamians. And while the term divine council never appears anywhere in the Bible, the concept certainly does in many books of the Bible. But the divine council that served under Yahweh was far different than the pantheons of other cultures. Yahweh is the only creator God. There is no equal to him. Everything is created by him and under him, which includes all the Elohim, angels, and humans. Psalm chapter 28 verse 1 reads, "God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment." The Hebrew word here translated as divine council is adat el, which means congregation of the divine. The word for gods is Elohim, which is not only used for Yahweh in some cases, but when it's plural, it's referring to angels that are supreme and judges. Based on what we have learned about angels, different classes of them were made for specific functions. The Elohim must have had something set aside about them that made them a higher class than the archangels. These are not the Watchers. Watchers were a separate class and currently reside in Tartarus because of their sin for creating the Nephilim with human women, which we talked about in the Nephilim episode. And sometimes this can get very confusing for people because I don't know why the Hebrews use the same word for both. So you have Elohim almost like with a capital E, I guess you could say, which would be for Yahweh. They didn't do it that way, but that's kind of the way I envision it in my mind. And then there's Elohim, which could be for all the lesser gods. And a lot of Christians have a very hard time with that word specifically, talking about these other angels or divine beings, however you want to refer to them. When people call them gods, they're like, well, wait a minute. That sounds like we're a polytheistic religion now instead of a monotheistic religion, just believing in one God. And that's true. We do only believe in one God. It's just this is the way they would reference them, was as these gods, but they're not the same as God the Creator, Yahweh. And that's why I like to use that name for him so that there's a differentiation between God and gods. And this is why I believe, and it's kind of cool for me because I loved mythology when I was a kid. I literally would go through the books and write down all the names of the different Greek gods and then their Roman counterpart, and then I'd write down what specifically were their powers, who was their father and mother, their sisters and brothers. I kind of would do like a whole family tree kind of thing. So now that I have looked into the fringy kind of things when it comes to the Bible, I'm like, what's really crazy is I was taught all those years in school, these are just myths. These are just stories that were made up to explain different things about the creation of the world and how humans came to be and animals and how people got fire. And Atlas holding up the earth and all this other stuff. And now I'm in a place where I'm like, you know what? Those gods were actual, real, divine beings. And they have different names depending upon what culture you're talking about. So I don't have a problem with calling them gods. If you want to just call them angels, that is fine. Or just use the term that the Hebrews used for them, the Elohim. Other Bible passages that refer to the divine council are Psalms chapter 89, verse 5, which reads, "Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones." And Job chapter 1, verse 6, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." So how many Elohim make up the divine council? Genesis 10 takes place after Noah's flood, and it's a list of the immediate descendants of Noah's son. This is called the Table of Nations. There are 70 names here for 70 nations, which represents completeness. The descendants of Jacob will also be 70 in number. And if you go back to some of the mythological stories, the god El, if you will recall, I don't remember, I think it was my episode on Mount Hermon. El, that was like his holy cosmic mountain or what have you, and he had his 70 sons up there. So this is where in those stories, because we know that the evil ones, the fallen ones, like to mimic what God does, that was their mimicry. So there were 70 sons of El, which is to parallel up against these 70 nations, or we have 70 Elohim that could be part of this divine council. This carries over to Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 to 9, where it says, "When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage." Interestingly, this isn't taught in most churches, and most Bible translations don't even have the correct translation here. They translate sons of God as sons of Israel. This makes for a completely different reading and makes no sense, since Yahweh took Israel as his portion. Israel is its own separate thing. It doesn't rule over these other countries. And there's that little issue with Israel not even actually existing at the time when this happened. And to rewind this back for people who aren't familiar, this goes back to the Tower of Babel episode that I did, and I believe that they were building their own cosmic mountain to mimic the mountain of God, his holy mountain. And in doing that, they were building probably a ziggurat or something of that nature, something that might have had a portal on it. But this is what the Tower of Babel was. And God saw that they were managing to, I feel like they wanted to have some kind of a rebirth, let me put it that way, of whatever the Watchers had done when they created their Nephilim. I kind of feel like that's what they were trying to do here. You know, Yahweh's looking down and going, oh my gosh, these meatheads, they're doing this again. So he gave them the different languages. And so at that time, as it said, he divided mankind and he fixed their borders. And he always has a purpose and a reason to everything. So it's like, why did he come up with 70 countries? Well, because there were 70 Elohim that were part of his divine council. And basically what he's telling them is, you guys are going to be in charge of these 70 nations. And then I have my people over here, which is going to become Israel. They're going to be my people. So this is my portion. You guys get the rest. He's given them a lot of responsibility. Or should I say, he's given them a lot of power. And what comes with great power, especially according to, was it Spider-Man's uncle who said this? With great power comes great responsibility. So there's a lot of responsibility on these Elohim who were allowed to be a part of God's divine council. So they're there for him to, hey, what do you guys think about this? Do you have an idea of what we could do about that? Not like God actually needs to have a board of directors or anybody giving their opinion, but I don't know. For some reason, he wanted to have this divine council. So he's given them all of this responsibility. And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors. Based on these verses in Genesis and Deuteronomy, it makes logical sense that there were 70 Elohim, and they were each given their own nation to be prince over, so they were called princes. Basically, what we have happening here is Yahweh has given his divine council the responsibility of watching over the Gentile nations while he's keeping the Israelites for himself. or probably even more specific, is that the nations and fallen ones were given over to each other. So you've got what's going to be these fallen countries or nations, and they're going to be watched over by, I did kind of tell you, fallen angels, because we are going to have some issues come up here, obviously. So this wasn't a good thing for either the sons of Yahweh or the nations. That's a lot of trust, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work out very well for some of the council, because some of the members of the council started receiving worship from the nations that they were over. This is what they did. This is part of their culture. They were already used to worshiping other gods, and now I believe that these Elohim were probably physically showing themselves in some form to these people, and so these people are, oh wow, look at this powerful person, and they're blessing us in our nation, and they're protecting us, and they're doing this, that, and the other thing. It's human nature to worship something like that, and they were already inclined to do that. That's what we're going to have happen here. You've got these Elohim who've become these princes over the nation, and they're like, hey, this is pretty cool. These guys are like worshiping us. These families are all doing things for us. They might even be sacrificing their children to us. Wow, this is pretty cool. So they like it, and they're going to embrace it. And some of these princes of the nations turned on Yahweh and the other angels. We see this most clearly played out in Daniel chapter 10, verse 13, where Daniel's asked God for an answer to prayer, and the archangel Gabriel's been sent with that answer, but he gets delayed. Gabriel tells Daniel, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia. So right here, we're finding out there's this prince of the kingdom of Persia. And it only makes common sense to me. We're not talking about an earthly king, because how does an earthly king keep an angel from delivering a message? There's no way. It has to be something else in the supernatural. And what we see based on this is, if you're on God's side, you're probably not going to try to stop Gabriel from getting his message. You'd probably help him get the message there, wouldn't you? So we're seeing here clearly, we have a prince of Persia, which is today Iran. He has tried to stop Gabriel. And he's quite powerful because Gabriel is an archangel. I believe Michael is a more powerful archangel, and clearly he had more strength because he had to come in and help Gabriel to get out of the situation. And that's a long time, 21 days. It's almost a month that Gabriel was delayed. Other questions that people might have, not just what are the numbers of the divine council, but where did the divine council meet? We often think of just Adam and Eve when the Garden of Eden is mentioned. But Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 13 says, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Eden is Yahweh's garden. That's why Adam and Eve had to leave once they sinned. This was the seat of the gods, and more than likely on top of a mountain. The fallen angels, like the devil, want to mimic what Yahweh does and what he has. If they were enticing men to build temples to them on mountains or setting up their own places on mountains, like in the myths about El and Baal, then it's safe to assume they are copying what Yahweh first did. The Mount of Assembly would have been Mount Zion. And so this is where Eden was probably located and where the divine council more than likely met. We see an example of how Yahweh uses his council to deliberate in 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 19 to 23. And Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. So what do we have going on here? First of all, I know there's a lot of people are going, so there's a lying spirit that God said, okay, I'm going to bless what you're going to do. Sounds like a good idea to me. Why would he support that? There are things about God that we are never going to understand. We aren't meant to understand. He is our creator God. And while I myself question a lot of things and I don't know exactly how this all works, this is clearly a fallen angel of some sort since it's a lying spirit. And God does use different things to get his will through. And in this case, he's like, hey, you stand forward and you say you're going to do something. You volunteered. I'll let you do it. Ahab had been king over Israel for about 22 years, and he worshipped Baal and did all kinds of evil things. The prophet Elijah would come and warn him, and those warnings always fell on deaf ears. King Ahab not only defied God, but he set up a challenge with 450 of his prophets of Baal against Elijah. In one of the strange passages in the Bible, and you know I love them, Elijah tells these prophets to prepare a bull by sacrificing it and putting it on an altar of wood, and then they are to call on Baal to consume it with fire. Despite much effort, there's no fire from Baal. So they're dancing around and they're chanting and they're like, hey, Baal, send down some fire. Come on. And they're going around and around and nothing is happening. So it's then Elijah's turn to prove Yahweh is supreme. He builds an altar, sacrifices the bull, puts it on the altar, but he goes a few steps further. He pours water all over everything. I mean, he gets it soaking wet. And then he calls out to Yahweh to send down fire. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 38 reads, "The fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench." So he's built a trench even to catch all this water. You heard that it consumed the wood and the stones? The fire from God consumed stone. That's pretty amazing. Ahab doesn't repent after this and just keeps being a really bad dude, so Yahweh decided he must die, and that lying spirit came forward and said, hey, I've got an idea for what we can do, God. I'll be that lying spirit. So he steps forward with a plan, and although this is a fallen spirit, Yahweh used it to his purposes, and this is just one of many examples of how Yahweh used his divine counsel. Believing that there is a divine counsel can change our perspective on mythology and history. Is it possible that the pantheons of all these ancient cultures were describing members of the divine council? Absolutely. Are there still princes over the nations? When Yeshua came, he came for the whole world, both the Israelites and the Gentiles. The gospel was taken to the Gentile world. Yeshua was seated at the right hand of Yahweh to rule and reign, meaning he rules over everything now. I'll have you rewind to a scene. Many of you probably know this one, where Jesus had been in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, and Satan decides he's going to give him a challenge. And he challenges him to all these things, and then the final challenge is he takes him up on a high mountain. This could be where Satan's holy mount was. Maybe it's up on Mount Hermon. It's somewhere where Jesus can look down and see a lot of the nations down there. And he says to him, if you'll bow down to me, I will give you all of this. And I remember when I was a kid and I was reading that, I'm like, how can Satan even say that? How can he say that he could give Yeshua all these nations? Because God owns everything, doesn't he? Because I didn't understand, this had not been explained to me, that there were these nations that had these angelic princes over them that were part of this divine council. So technically, Satan, since he seems to have been head over all of the fallen ones, he had control of all the nations. So he could tell those princes, hey, Yeshua bowed down to me. You can give him, Persia and all these different places, Egypt and everything else. But of course, Yeshua knew that when he got up on that cross and gave his life for us, everything was going to be his. Everything would be right the way it was supposed to be, because everything was supposed to be under Yahweh and Yeshua from the very beginning until sin came into the world. And we had our initial fall with the angelic beings, and then we had our fall. So he basically was going to right all of that, and then he was going to have the power over all of the nations. These princes are not over the nations anymore. Although when you look at some of these nations, it's like they've got somebody in charge, it seems like. It doesn't mean that they're not still causing havoc and doing whatever they want. But the ultimate king is Yeshua, and he is ruling and reigning over those nations today. It's important to keep in mind that the members of the divine council are heavenly beings and are under Yahweh. This means they are subject to him and his divine decrees. They could never be equal to Yahweh. And that is where these stories from other cultures miss the mark. What I've presented here is a summary of the divine council, and Christians who have seen this in the scripture and interpret the Bible, prophecy, and the world through this lens are said to have a divine council worldview. Should you have that kind of worldview? The ghost in you knows. I encourage, for those of you, this might be some new information. If you would like to get more information on this, check out thedivinecouncil.com. It is a place where the late Dr. Michael Heiser had a lot of his work. A lot of it is very technical, and it could be a little hard to get through, but he has some other stuff there that's a little bit easier to understand as well. But I encourage you to check that out. Thank you for joining me on this episode. May God bless you and keep you. This has been a production of History Goes Bump.